A man calls for water. Not wine. Not a scroll. Not a sword. Water, in a basin, in front of a crowd that has been shouting for almost an hour. He is the most powerful person in the room, and every eye turns to watch him do something almost nobody in his position ever does in public. He dips his hands in. He rubs them together, slowly, the way you might if you were trying to get something off your skin that you weren't and oppose. T sure was really there. And then he says the words that have echoed for 2,000 years. End quote. I am innocent of the blood of this just person, end quote. You already know his name. Pontius Pilate, Roman governor of Judea. The man who, in a few short hours, will send an innocent man to the cross, and yet stands there, in front of everyone, washing his hands like a man trying to prove something to himself as much as to the crowd. Here and oppose. That's what almost nobody tells you about this moment. It was and oppose, a Roman habit. Romans didn't and oppose, wash their hands to declare innocence at an execution. There was no such custom in their law, no such gesture in their courts. It was and oppose, a nervous tick, either some fidget dreamed up under pressure. And it was and oppose, an empty gesture, a bit of theater with no real weight behind it. This is not a Roman custom. This is not a nervous tick. This is not an empty gesture. This is a governor reaching back, deliberately, precisely, into a Hebrew ritual he almost certainly learned from the very people he was trying to please. A ritual with a strict set of rules. A ritual meant for exactly one kind of crime. An unsolved murder. Stay with me, because this is where it gets strange. That ritual only works when nobody knows who the killer is. And on that morning, in that courtyard, everybody knew. The priests knew. The crowd knew. His own soldiers knew. Pilate himself gave the order. So why would a man like this, a man with a documented record of cruelty, a man who had never once in his career stopped to perform a ritual of conscience before killing someone, suddenly call for a bowl of water on this particular morning, for this particular man? If you can answer that question by the end of this video, you and oppose. LL understands something about Matthew 27 that most people never catch, no matter how many times they and oppose, read it. We and oppose, we're going to get to that. But not yet. Because before you can understand what Pilate did wrong, you have to understand who Pilate really was. For a long time, some scholars wondered if Pilate was even a real historical figure, or just a name added to make the gospel story feel official. Then, in 1961, archaeologists working at Caesarea Maritima, the old Roman capital on the Judean coast, dug up a slab of limestone. Carved into it, in Latin, were the words, end quote, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, end quote. Not a legend, not a literary device. A real man, with a real title, carved in stone by his own government while he still held office. And once you know who he really was, the water in that basin gets a lot harder to explain away. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote about Pilate more than once, and never kindly. Neither did Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary who described him as stubborn, cruel, and prone to executions with no trial at all. Here in oppose, S1 detailed Josephus records that most viewers have never heard. At one point, Pilate sent soldiers into the middle of a crowd of Galileans, while they were in the act of offering sacrifices, and had them killed on the spot. Their blood mixed with the blood of the animals on the altar. That and oppose, the kind of governor Pilate was. Not cautious, not conflicted, not the type to lose sleep over an execution. And this is where it gets remarkable. A man like that, a man with blood already on his hands from a dozen other mornings, had never once called for a basin of water before. Not for the Galileans. Not for anyone else he and oppose, ordered killed. This is the only recorded moment in his entire career where Pontius Pilate stops, in public, and performs a ritual about guilt. Picture what you would have seen if you were standing in that crowd. A governor who governed with a whip and a sword. A man who put down riots without a second thought, suddenly asking a servant for a bowl he had never asked for before. You would have felt it too, that flicker of confusion running through the crowd. Something is different about this one. Something about this prisoner is getting under the skin of a man nothing usually touches. So something about this particular morning got under his skin. Part of it may have started the night before, or maybe that very morning, when a message arrived from his own household. His wife, unnamed in the gospel text, though later tradition gives her the name Claudia Procula, sent word to him in the middle of the trial. She told him to have nothing to do with, and quote, that just man, and quote, because of a dream that had troubled her deeply. A dream urgent enough to interrupt a Roman governor mid-trial. And Pilate does something almost nobody notices on a first read. When he stands to wash his hands, he uses her exact word for Jesus. Just the same word his wife used, hours earlier, in a warning he chose to ignore. Now look closer at the Greek behind that hand-washing itself, because the original language is doing more work than the English translation lets on. The word is aponipto, not the ordinary word for washing, but a stronger one, meaning to wash off completely, to scrub something away from the surface. And it and apos, s written in a reflexive form. Pilate isn and apos, t washing his hands for the crowd. He and apos, s washing them for himself. And when he says he is, and quote, innocent, and quote, the Greek word there is athous. It doesn't and apos, t mean morally clean. It and apos, s a legal term. It means not liable, not chargeable, off the hook. Pilate isn and apos, t claiming his conscience is clear. He and apos, s claiming the paperwork is clear. Those are two very different things, and the Greek makes sure you can and apos, t miss it. Here and apos, s the part nobody tells you. This was and apos, t a man losing control of the room. This was a calculated legal move, dressed up as a religious one, performed by a governor who knew exactly what kind of ritual he was borrowing, and exactly which crowd would recognize it. Because they would recognize it. Almost everyone standing in that courtyard that morning had grown up knowing the ritual Pilate was about to imitate. So here in apos, s where we are. A brutal governor. A wife and apos, s warning, ignored. A strange, deliberate ritual borrowed from somewhere else. If you and apos, renew here, this channel is where we take moments like this one, the ones you and apos, ve read past 100 times without stopping, and slow them down until they dawn and apos, t look ordinary anymore. Hit subscribe if that and apos, s the kind of thing you want more of, and tell me in the comments where you and apos, re-watching from. Now let and apos, s get to the ritual itself, because this is where the whole story turns. Long before Pilate ever stood in that courtyard, the law of Israel had already written down what a governor, or an elder, or a judge, was supposed to do when someone turned up dead and nobody knew who did it. It and apos, s found in the 21st chapter of Deuteronomy, and it and apos, s called, in Hebrew, the egla arufa, the heifer whose neck is broken. Here and apos, s how it worked. If a body was discovered lying in an open field, outside any town, with no witness and no known killer, the elders of the nearest town had a job to do. They would take a young cow that had never been worked, lead it down to a valley with running water, and break its neck there. Then, and this is the detail that matters most, the elders would wash their hands over that dead animal, and say out loud, and quote, our hands did not shed this blood, neither did our eyes see it, and quote, and they would ask God to forgive the land. So the whole community would and apos, t be held responsible for one unsolved death. It and apos, s a strange ritual to modern ears, but the logic behind it is simple. Unsolved blood is dangerous. It leaves guilt hanging over a whole community with nowhere to land. So the ritual gives that guilt somewhere to go. A sacrifice, a river, a public declaration, and God and apos, s forgiveness at the end of it. Here and apos, that's what most people miss. Pilate didn't and apos, t invent a new gesture that morning. He reached back into this exact ritual and performed a version of it, right down to the water and the words of innocence. But everything about his situation makes it fall apart. Let and apos, s count the ways, because there are 5, and once you see them, you and apos, ll never read Matthew 27 the same way again. 1. The killer isn and apos, t hidden. The entire point of the Deuteronomy ritual is that nobody knows who did it. In this case, everybody knows. Pilate himself gave the order. There and apos, s no mystery here to atone for. There and apos, s a decision, made in daylight, in front of witnesses. 2. The wrong person is washing his hands. In the original ritual, the elders performing the rite are the ones farthest from the crime. Bystanders, representatives of a town that had nothing to do with the death. Pilate is not a bystander. He is the judge who signed off on the execution. He is, in every sense that matters, the man closest to the blood, not the man farthest from it. 3. There and apos, no death underneath the water. In Deuteronomy, the ritual only works because something has already died. The heifer, standing in for the community, its blood already spilled into the valley before anyone and apos' hands touch water. Pilate has no sacrifice beneath his hands. Just water. Plain water, with nothing underneath it to actually carry the weight of what he and apos' declaring. 4. The prayer is pointed in the wrong direction. The elders in Deuteronomy speak upward, to God, asking for forgiveness on behalf of the land. Pilate speaks outward, to the crowd, handing the responsibility to them. End quote. See ye to it, end quote. He tells them. Not end quote. Forgive us, end quote. Not end quote. Have mercy, end quote. Just, this is now your problem, not mine. 5. The priests are in the wrong place. In the original ritual, priests are present to witness and confirm that the rite has been carried out properly. In Pilate and apos' courtroom, the chief priests are there too, but not to confirm anything sacred. They and apos' there because they demanded this execution in the first place. The very people whose presence should validate an act of innocence are, instead, the ones pushing hardest for the death. 5 points. 5 ways the ritual breaks apart in Pilate and apos' hands. He performs every outward motion of a rite designed to prove innocence and manages to invert every single element that gives the rite its meaning. He and apos' washing away guilt. He and apos' demonstrating exactly how guilty he is, because only a guilty man reaches for a ritual meant for someone else and apos' crime. Think about how strange that is for a moment. A ritual built to comfort the innocent has been picked up by a man trying to comfort himself while standing in the middle of the crime. It and apos' a little like watching someone read a eulogy over a person they killed, and somehow expecting the words themselves to change what happened. The words are real. The ritual is real. But borrowing the shape of innocence doesn't and apos' put innocence inside you. That and apos' true for a Roman governor in the 1st century, and it and apos' just as true for you, watching this 2,000 years later. Pilate wasn't and apos' the first person in Scripture to reach for water and talk about clean hands. This theme runs through the whole Bible, long before Matthew ever picked up his pen. David writes about it in the Psalms. End quote. I will wash my hands in innocence, end quote. He says, end quote, so I can go around your altar, Lord, end quote. For David, clean hands are something you bring to God, not something you use to walk away from him. The water is preparation for worship, not a substitute for it. Job says something else worth hearing here. He imagines washing himself with snow water, scrubbing his hands with the strongest soap anyone in his world could find, and he says even that wood and apos' be enough. Even the cleanest water in the world can and apos' reach the kind of stain Job is talking about. It sits somewhere water was never designed to touch. This is not a story about a number. This is not a story about a verse. This is not a story about a single strange gesture in a Roman courtyard. This is a story about every place in Scripture where hands get held up as proof of something, and every place where God quietly points out that the proof is in and apos' in the hands at all. And here in apos' where the thread ties all the way back to something Jesus himself said, just 12 chapters earlier in the very same gospel. In Matthew 15, some religious leaders confront Jesus because his disciples ate without performing the ceremonial hand washing. And Jesus tells them something that must have sounded almost offensive at the time. It and apos' not what goes into a man through unwashed hands that makes him unclean, he says. It and apos' what comes out of a man and apos' heart. Murder, lies, cruelty. Those are the things that defile a person, not the state of his fingers. Now watch what happens 12 chapters later. The same gospel writer, Matthew, sets down the story of a Roman governor standing in front of a crowd, hands freshly washed, believing that water on his skin has settled the matter of his guilt. It and apos' almost too perfect to be an accident. Jesus taught, with his own mouth, that clean hands mean nothing if the heart underneath them is compromised. And then his own trial becomes the clearest illustration of that exact lesson that the Gospels ever record. That and apos' The open loop we planted at the very start of this video. Why did the most brutal governor in Judea and Apos' recorded history stop on this one morning to perform a ritual of innocence he and Apos' never bothered with before? Because on this one morning, for the first time in his career, he needed one. Every other execution he could live with. This one, something in him, maybe his wife and Apos' warning, maybe the look on the prisoner and Apos' face, maybe just the sheer weight of what he was about to authorize, told him he needed an alibi. Not for Rome, not even for the crowd, for himself. And that and Apos' not just a first-century problem. Think about the last time you knew something was wrong, and instead of stopping it, you found a way to make it not quite your fault. Maybe you didn't and Apos' call for a basin of water, but you found your own version of it. You followed the process instead of following your conscience. You let a policy make the decision, so you wooed and Apos' have to. You said, end quote, I just work here, end quote, or end quote, that and Apos' not my department, end quote, or end quote, I was just following orders, end quote, while the thing you could have stopped happened anyway, a few feet away from you. Maybe it was smaller than that. Maybe you watched someone get talked about behind their back, and you didn't and Apos' say anything, and later you told yourself you hadn't and Apos' really been part of it. You were just standing there. You weren't and Apos' the one talking. That and Apos' your basin. That and Apos' your water. And it works about as well as Pilate and Apos' did, which is to say, it doesn't and Apos' work at all, because your hands still know what they saw. That and Apos' Pilate and Apos' basin. You just don and Apos' call it that. You saw it happen once more before that trial ever reached its end, and you might have missed it. Judas Iscariot, the man who handed Jesus over in the first place, comes back to the chief priests with the 30 pieces of silver still in his hands. End quote. I have sinned, end quote. He tells them, end quote, in that I have betrayed innocent blood, end quote. And they answer him with 4 words that might be colder than anything Pilate ever says. End quote. What is that to us? End quote. They hand the guilt back to him, the same way Pilate will hand it to the crowd a few hours later. Everyone in this story is passing the same coal from hand to hand, and nobody wants to be the one left holding it when it finally burns. Everyone, that is, except the one man standing silently in the middle of all of it. Jesus doesn't and Apos' defend himself. Jesus doesn't and Apos' pass the coal to anyone else. He simply carries what ISN and Apos' is to carry, while a governor washes his hands a few feet away and a crowd shouts for blood that will land, they say, on themselves and on their children. If you step back and look at the whole courtroom at once, you and Apos' notice something almost nobody preaches on. Every single person in that scene has a chance to stop what and Apos' happening. The priests could have dropped the charge. The crowd could have gone silent. Pilate, with the full authority of Rome behind him, could have simply said no. You have that same authority more often than you think. Not over an execution, but over a decision, a rumor, a moment where staying quiet is easier than standing up. Nobody in this story chooses to stand up. Everyone chooses the basin instead. So what do you actually walk away with from a basin of water in a Roman courtroom 2,000 years ago? First, the truth about the moment itself. Pilate and Apos' hand-washing wasn't Apos' a spontaneous act of guilt or a meaningless bit of theater. It was a deliberate, legally minded imitation of a Hebrew ritual meant for unsolved murders, performed in the one murder that was never a mystery to anyone in that courtyard. He knew exactly what he was borrowing. He just couldn't and Apos' make it fit. Second, what that means for you. Water has never been able to do what Pilate needed it to do. Not in his case, and not in yours. You cannot wash away responsibility with a procedure, a policy, or a well-timed disclaimer. If your hands are on the decision, your hands are on the decision. No basin changes that. You can call it a technicality. You can call it, end quote, not my department, end quote. You can call it whatever helps you sleep at night. Scripture calls it what David and Job already knew, a stain that water was never built to reach. Third, and this is the one worth sitting with. There was one person in that entire courtyard who didn't and Apos' try to wash anything away. Who didn't and Apos' shift the blame to the crowd, or the priests, or the soldiers, or the process. Jesus stood there in silence, carrying weight that wasn't Apos his to carry, so that people like Pilate, people like Judas, people like the crowd shouting for his blood, and people like you and me could finally set our own basins down for good. Which part of this hit you hardest? The Deuteronomy ritual you and Apos never heard connected to this verse before. The Greek behind the word innocent, or the thought of your own basin, the thing you and Apos used to walk away from something that was actually yours to own? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. Pilate washed his hands that morning and walked away believing he was finished with the matter. He wasn't Apos and neither are you until you stop washing and start owning what Apos actually yours.